It began with sirens cutting through the night like razors through silk. I was waist deep in my own lake, the water still warm from the setting sun, when the flashing blue and red lights painted the pines along the shoreline. For a moment I thought someone had drowned, but the deputy who stepped from the cruiser didn't carry urgency. He carried paperwork. Sheriff's Deputy Martinez held a citation like it was a weapon, his face caught between embarrassment and disbelief. Behind him, at the edge of my gravel drive, stood Karen Whitmore, arms folded, smile sharpened into something predatory. She didn't need words. Her presence was the accusation. Her power was the weapon. My crime? Swimming in water my grandfather had claimed with sweat and calloused hands 70 years earlier. The deputy cleared his throat and said the words that made reality tilt. "Sir, I have to issue you a $1,000 fine for unauthorized recreational water use." That was the moment I realized the truth about people like Karen. They don't just covet control, they manufacture it, carving it out of thin air with a mixture of audacity and forgotten ordinances. She looked at me like I was an intruder in my own life, a trespasser on sacred ground that only existed because her subdivision had declared it so. And yet, I had history written into the soil, deeds older than her entire HOA. The fine wasn't about rules, it was about domination, about reminding me that even in my sanctuary, even in the place I had retreated to mend a shattered life, power could hunt me down. Because the lake wasn't just water, it was memory. My wife's laughter had echoed off these ripples before cancer claimed her voice forever. My grandfather had cast his line into this surface after returning broken from war. Every inch of it was my inheritance, my therapy, my final anchor in a world that had taken too much already. And here stood Karen, treating it like a bargaining chip in her endless campaign to turn control into currency. I stood dripping on the dock, citation in hand, the ink smearing where water met paper. In that moment, something hardened inside me. She thought she was playing with a broken man, but I had spent 2 decades dissecting bureaucracies and exposing corruption. She had just awakened the part of me that knew how to turn their own rules into chains. The war had begun. My name is Garrett Henderson, and before Karen tried to rewrite my life with fines and ordinances, I had already been broken once. 3 years earlier, cancer hollowed out my world in the most merciless way possible. My wife Sarah and I had built 22 years of rituals together. Coffee at dawn, quiet walks at dusk, the kind of ordinary moments you don't realize are sacred until they vanish. When she was gone, the silence of our house became unbearable. It was like living inside an abandoned cathedral where every echo reminded me of what I had lost. That's when I came here, to the land my grandfather had passed down. 4 acres in rural North Carolina, bordered by pines that whispered like old confidants, centered around a spring-fed lake that had been the lifeline of my family since 1952. Pop built the original cabin when he came back from Korea, his hands shaking from memories he never talked about. This place healed him. He always said, "The lake remembers what you pour into it. Fear, grief, hope. Give it enough time, and it gives you back something cleaner." I clung to those words. Morning after morning, I sat on the dock with Sarah's chipped coffee mug, watching mist rise from the water like spirits dancing in the dawn. It became my ritual, my anchor, the one place where my chest loosened enough to breathe again. The trout I stocked weren't for commerce, they were for memory, for continuity, for the elucid. On that life could still be nurtured. For months, this was my sanctuary. The outside world faded into something distant. I wasn't a finance director anymore, the man who'd spent decades auditing budgets and catching crooked contractors. I was just a grieving husband who needed water and silence to survive. But peace is never permanent. Developers came first, bulldozers tearing down oaks older than my grandfather's war scars. The forest that once shielded me thinned, and with it came the smell of diesel, the sound of chainsaws, And finally, the McMansions. 47 of them, sprouting up like monuments to greed along the northern ridge. They weren't neighbors. They were invaders in pressed suits and leased luxury sedans. And at the center of them, like a queen staking claim to a chessboard, came Karen Whitmore. She was the kind of person who confuses property lines with thrones, and she mistook my lake for her crown jewel. I didn't know it then, but grief had drawn me here to heal, and now it was going to arm me for war. It started with footsteps, heels clicking across my gravel driveway like a metronome of intrusion. Karen arrived carrying store-bought cookies wrapped in cellophane and tied with a ribbon, the kind of gift that pretends to be generous but reeks of strategy. She'd smile wide, compliment my quaint little cabin, and slip in questions about whether I'd ever considered selling. Her perfume was thick, synthetic, something that clashed violently with the clean pine air. I could smell the ambition beneath it. When I declined her offers, politely at first, firmly later, the smile faltered. Her eyes, cold and surgical, revealed what the cookies had concealed. She wasn't here to welcome me. She was here to domesticate me, to fold me into her subdivision like a rebellious page in her rule book. And when I refused, the shift began. The first complaint arrived 2 weeks later, an official envelope taped to my door, allegation of an unpermitted dock. I laughed bitterly. My permits were from 2008, older than her entire neighborhood. I provided the documentation and the county dismissed it, but Karen wasn't discouraged. She escalated. The second complaint accused my stocked trout of contaminating the watershed. An environmental inspector drove out, tested the water, and ended up complimenting its purity. Cleaner than half the municipal supplies, he said, shaking his head at the absurdity, but absurdity was Karen's weapon. She didn't need to win, she only needed to exhaust. That was her brilliance, if you can call it that. She understood that most people buckle not under one blow, but under the endless weight of small ones. It was death by paper cuts. Each envelope, each county call, each anonymous concern chipped away at the tranquility I'd fought so hard to build. But Karen wasn't improvising. She had studied the system. Somewhere in her crusade, she unearthed a relic from the 1920s, an ordinance about recreational water usage permits, a fossil of law that had survived in dusty books no one bothered to challenge. She convinced county commissioners, former clients of hers conveniently, that it should be amended retroactively. Suddenly, lake activity within 500 feet of residential developments required HOA approval. My lake, my bloodline's lake, now stamped with her approval or denial. That was the day I saw her not as a neighbor, but as a tyrant in designer shoes. And that was the day I decided, if she wanted to play in the shadows of law and bureaucracy, I would drag her into a light she couldn't survive. 2 weeks after the citation, I was on my porch sipping coffee from Sarah's chipped mug when I heard the crunch of tires on gravel. Not one car, several. The morning breeze carried pine and diesel, and something else, that faint, sour smell of cheap cologne and bureaucratic desperation. I knew before I saw her, Karen was back. She stepped out of her white BMW with the smirk of someone convinced the board had been tilted in her favor, but this time she didn't come alone. Beside her waddled a man in a county inspector uniform that fit like a borrowed costume. His name tag read Randy Morrison, and he clutched a clipboard as though it were Excalibur. His eyes darted nervously, but Karen's presence gave him false confidence. "Mr. Henderson," she announced sweetly, her voice dripping with the kind of faux politeness that burns hotter than open hostility. "We've received an anonymous complaint about your commercial fishing operation." I nearly spat out my coffee. "Commercial fishing?" I asked. "Lady, I stock this lake for myself. Always have." Randy puffed his chest, slapping his clipboard against his thigh with a nervous rhythm. "Sir, unless you can provide a business license for this aquaculture facility, I'll have to issue daily fines of $500 until you comply." There it was, the con. I'd seen it 100 times in my municipal days. crooked inspectors pretending to wield authority, hoping fear will make their target fold. But I wasn't some rookie homeowner blindsided by jargon. I'd spent decades dissecting fraudsters just like him. I played along. I showed him my deed, my personal use permits, even the stocking receipts. He barely glanced at them before repeating his threat. It was theater, badly rehearsed. That night, I opened my old laptop. The glow of the screen felt like a weapon being unsheathed. Years of experience told me every fraud leaves a trail, and Randy had been sloppy. Within an hour, I discovered his inspector's license had expired 2 years ago. The man harassing me wasn't even authorized to inspect a lemonade stand. I screenshotted everything, filed a complaint with the state licensing board. Then I kept digging. Public records revealed a pattern. Randy had been running inspections across 3 counties with no credentials. This wasn't incompetence. It was systemic fraud. By the time I shut the laptop, I knew 2 things. Randy was about to implode, and Karen had just linked herself to a sinking ship. She thought she was tightening a noose. Instead, she'd handed me the rope. The downfall began quietly, like cracks spiderwebbing through glass before it shatters. 2 days after my complaint, the state licensing board reached out to Randy Morrison. Word traveled fast through county offices. By the end of the week, whispers spread of Randy's meltdown. A man who built his fraud on forged authority suddenly faced a $10,000 fine and possible criminal charges, and behind the scenes, everyone knew who had triggered it. Karen's phone must have been burning. I could almost picture the panic in her manicured hands as Randy called, begging her to fix this somehow. But Karen didn't retreat. She pivoted, like a cornered animal baring its teeth. 3 days later, an envelope appeared in my mailbox. Official letterhead. The HOA demanding $500 per month in liability insurance surcharges for dangerous water activities. They backdated it to January. By July, I supposedly owed $3,000 for swimming in water my grandfather had dug with a borrowed bulldozer in 1952. I read the notice twice, then laughed so hard it scared a loon off the lake. It was audacity distilled into paper. But audacity is fragile when you know where to press. I filed for a preliminary injunction in county court, citing precedent I knew by heart. Lucas v. South Carolina Coastal Council, a case where bureaucrats tried to strip a man of property use without compensation. The Supreme Court ruled it unconstitutional. The principle was simple. Government can't annihilate your property rights with invented fees. Karen had built her surcharge on sand. But I didn't stop there. My instincts told me to dig deeper. I hired a surveyor to confirm my property lines. When the results came back, it felt like Christmas morning. Karen's precious subdiv, Isian, had spilled over its boundaries. 15 feet of encroachment onto state forest land. 3 McMansions, including one owned by her cousin Danny, were technically trespassing. I made an anonymous tip to the state forestry department. Within a week, violation notices landed on their doorsteps. $50,000 fines per structure, plus potential removal costs. Karen's $3,000 shakedown looked like pocket change next to 6 figures of state-enforced penalties. The morning after the notices, Karen stormed across my property line, red-faced and trembling, her stilettos grinding gravel like gunfire. She jabbed a manicured finger at me and screamed about harassment, about ruining property values. She threatened lawsuits, bankruptcy, public humiliation. I let her rage, then handed her a copy of my injunction filing, still warm from the printer. "See you in court, Karen," I said calmly. "Bring your checkbook." For the first time, her plastic smile cracked into silence. She had drawn blood, but now she realized I could bleed her dry. Karen's next move wasn't on paper. It was on screens. One morning, while pouring coffee, I got a text from an old friend. "Turn on Channel 7. And there she was, Karen, sitting primly in a local news studio, dressed in soft pastels, her voice cracking at just the right moments. She painted me as a menace, a recluse running an unregulated fishery that threatened children, wildlife, even drinking water. She invoked buzzwords: safety, compliance, community values. She even clutched a framed photo of her daughter playing in the subdivision park, as if my trout posed more danger than her own negligence. It was performance art, but she underestimated me. The first rule of financial fraud cases, and HOA battles are nothing but fraud in pearls, is documentation. I had timestamps, permits, environmental reports, even drone footage of her encroachments. I uploaded it all into a neatly organized online drive, then sent the link anonymously to 3 reporters who'd covered HOA corruption before. 2 days later, headlines flipped. Local HOA president. Linked to illegal inspector. Subdivision homes cited for encroachment. Property owner counters harassment with evidence trail. Karen's pastel halo cracked. The same anchors who had coddled her were suddenly circling with questions she couldn't spin away from. The camera caught her once perfect smile twitching when a reporter asked, "Did you knowingly employ an unlicensed inspector to target your neighbor?" But Karen wasn't done. She doubled down. Flyers appeared around town accusing me of hoarding water rights, draining aquifers, destroying community trust. Neighbors whispered. At the grocery store, a man in golf attire sneered at me, muttering, "Selfish bastard." That night, standing on my dock under a rising moon, I thought of Sarah. She had warned me once, "They don't fight fair, but bullies only win if you play by their rules." So I made a choice, not to play defense anymore, to tell the story myself. I called a reporter, not to rant, not to retaliate, but to share the history of this lake, how my grandfather dug it, how generations swam in it, how I stocked it not for profit, but to keep the ecosystem alive. I gave them documents, photos, oral history. It wasn't just a rebuttal, it was a legacy. When the article ran, the opening line carried my words, "This lake is older than their bylaws." That phrase became a spark. It spread through social media, painted on protest signs, whispered at HOA meetings. Strangers stopped me at diners to shake my hand. For the first time, Karen was the outsider, the empire builder trying to erase what had stood before her. And just like that, the war was no longer about me. It was about them. All the families, all the histories, all the people crushed by HOA overreach. Karen had awakened something she couldn't control. Desperation makes people reckless. And Karen was nothing if not desperate. The community had shifted. The press had turned. The phrase, "This lake is older than their bylaws," echoed louder than her polished speeches. Every HOA meeting felt thinner, emptier. The board members glancing nervously at each other as whispers of audits and lawsuits crept closer. But Karen wasn't finished. Not yet. One evening, just after dusk, I noticed movement at the water's edge. Headlights off, a dark SUV idled near the culvert that feeds the lake. 2 men got out. They carried buckets. My stomach turned cold. They weren't neighbors, they were contractors. And inside those buckets was dye, bright chemical blue, illegal, toxic. I didn't need a sample to know Karen was about to poison my lake. I filmed everything from the dock, faces, plates, buckets pouring into the current. Rage tightened my chest, but training held me steady. Evidence first, action second. The next morning, the water near the culvert glowed an unnatural turquoise. Dead minnows floated belly up. Karen arrived not long after, flanked by Randy, out on bail, somehow still trailing behind her like a wounded hound. She staged the scene for a photographer, pointing at the water with practiced outrage. "See? Contamination. Proof of his unregulated operation." But this time, I was ready. I stepped out, camera in hand, and held it high so everyone could see the recording. The contractors, the buckets, the dye pouring in. Karen's face blanched. "You tried to frame me," I said, my voice cutting through the crowd of gawkers that had gathered. "You poisoned my water, and you dragged this community into your lies." A murmur rolled through the neighbors. Anger, betrayal, disbelief. Someone shouted, "You went too far, Karen!" I contacted the State Environmental Agency that afternoon, not just with video, but with lab samples, timestamps, and sworn witness accounts. By evening, a formal investigation had opened. Karen had crossed a line from civil dispute to felony crime. Still, she didn't retreat. At the next emergency HOA meeting, she stormed the podium and accused me of fabricating evidence, hacking her emails, conspiring with government officials to destroy her. Her eyes were wild now, no longer the cold precision of a suburban queen. She was unraveling, clawing at shadows. And yet, she still had allies. A handful of loyalists clapped. Others muttered threats as they passed me in the parking lot. Karen had lost control of the narrative, but she wasn't gone. A cornered animal can still bite. The war was boiling toward its final act. The final blow didn't come in a courtroom. It came in a ballroom. The county's annual development summit was a black tie affair where builders, realtors, and politicians preened for each other. This year, Karen was slated as keynote speaker, her last platform of power. She planned to spin the poisoning scandal as a smear campaign to paint herself once again as the victim of a deranged recluse with a vendetta. But she never saw what was waiting. A week earlier, through discovery in my injunction case, I'd unearthed something buried in her HOA's financial records. Kickbacks. Hundreds of thousands funneled quietly through maintenance contracts to shell companies owned by Randy and Karen's cousin Danny. Fraud, embezzlement, paper trails as clear as footprints in fresh snow. The morning of the summit, I leaked it all to reporters, regulators, and the state attorney's office, not with fanfare, just raw, undeniable evidence. That evening, Karen stood under chandeliers, her voice swelling with the usual buzzwords: community, progress, safety. She barely got 5 minutes in before the first reporter's phone lit up with an alert, then another, then a dozen. By the time Karen clicked to her next PowerPoint slide, the room was buzzing like a hornet's nest. Reporters left their seats, cameras swiveled. A councilman in the front row stood, face pale, and walked out. And then, as though scripted by fate, 2 investigators from the state attorney's office read the ballroom. They didn't make a scene. They didn't need to. They approached Karen quietly, badges flashing. Her microphone squealed as it hit the floor. The audience erupted, not in applause, not in outrage, but in the stunned collective exhale of people watching a facade collapse in real time. Karen was escorted out, her designer heels clicking against marble like the hollow echoes of a dynasty dying. Randy followed weeks later, indicted for fraud, Danny too for illegal encroachment deals. The subdivision board dissolved under state receivership. Homeowners finally saw their dues returned, their gag orders lifted, their fear broken. And me? I went back to the water. The lake healed slowly. The poisoned culvert ran clean again. Families came to swim, fish, laugh, without permission slips, without harassment. The phrase that had carried through protests and headlines carved itself into permanence. One neighbor painted it on a wooden sign at the shoreline, where sunlight caught the letters every dawn. This lake is older than their bylaws. It wasn't just my victory, it was everyone's. Proof that even when power strangles truth, even when fraud wears a crown, a single person with evidence, persistence, and a refusal to bow can bring it all crashing down. Karen had tried to bury me. Instead, she buried herself. And the lake, our lake, endured. Years have passed since Karen's empire collapsed. The subdivision she once ruled is quieter now. The HOA exists only in the faded ink of court archives, its bylaws dissolved, its bank accounts emptied into restitution funds. The houses remain, but without the iron grip of Karen's board. Neighbors talk again, over fences, across driveways, at bonfires by the lake. The fear is gone, replaced by something fragile, but real: trust. The lake itself tells the truest story. Where poisoned dye once clouded its surface, Clear water now ripples in morning light. Children chase minnows along the shore. Retirees cast lines in the cool dawn air. Ducks nest without being chased off by compliance officers. He sign still stands at the dock, weathered by rain and sun, carrying the words that became a rallying cry. This lake is older than their bylaws. Karen? She never returned. Her name drifts through town like a ghost, spoken in cautionary tones, a parable about pride and downfall. Some say she moved states away. Others whisper about court dates, settlements, debts. But her power here is gone, reduced to a cautionary tale told at backyard barbecues. And me? I kept my promise to Sarah. Every spring, I stock the lake again, not because I have to, but because I want to. Because the fight was never just about permits or fish or property lines. It was about memory, legacy, the right of ordinary people to stand their ground against those who think money and paperwork can erase history. Sometimes reporters still call, asking me to comment on the case that exposed HOA corruption. I always tell them the same thing. It wasn't about corruption. It was about home. Because in the end, that's what Karen never understood. She saw land. I saw roots. She saw profit. I saw memory. She saw power. I saw community. And community, when it finally wakes up, is stronger than any bylaw, any board, any queen on a paper throne. The war ended, the lake endured, and the story became legend.